turning out on such a beautiful afternoon. It's a real pleasure for me to be back here after so many years. It doesn't seem possible that it's been that many years since I left the PhD program here. And when I was in this program, there were typically 1 or 2 people admitted per year. I think there were 10 or 12 full-time faculty over in the Howell Hall. It was much smaller, much smaller. And it's amazing how it's grown over the years. I still think that those years were some of the best of my life, and certainly some of the most formative years of my life. And any success I've had at Indiana, I always attribute to the doctoral program here at UNC. So if you're doctoral students here, I would say that you're very lucky that you're in a really good program. And I think you look back on these years and really appreciate what you got from this program. As Don was saying, I have worked mainly in 2 different areas. I worked a lot in agenda setting with Don and Max McCombs, mostly agenda setting studies of various elections, especially the 1972, 76, and 1980 elections. But I've also been involved in a lot of studies of journalists over the years, kind of modeled on the first big national survey of journalists, which was done by John Johnstone and his colleagues in sociology at the University of Illinois in the Chicago Circle campus. And after he did his kind of groundbreaking study in 1971, I and Lee Wilwhite, who was also a graduate of this program, the first graduate actually, in 1967, we did a couple of studies, big national studies of journalists in 1982 and 1992. And so I worked in both areas, and today I'm going to talk a bit about journalism research, but I'm also going to try to make a kind of a bridge between these 2 areas, between journalism research and agenda setting research, because I think there are some connections. So let me get started here. During the past few decades, there's been a lot of increased interest in studying journalism and journalists, especially in the last 5 years or so. We've got 2 new journals in this first decade, since 2000 of this century, Journalism Studies and Journalism Theory, Practice, and Criticism. They were both founded, or they both began in the spring of 2000. We've got a Journalism Studies interest group of the ICA now, the International Communication Association, which began only 4 years ago with about 50 members and now has more than 500. So it's one of the fastest growing groups in the ICA. We have many recent books and articles on journalists and journalism in this past decade, and including some that I've been involved in. And my most recent effort has been to edit a book with a professor from Germany, Martin Luffelholz. This book is called Global Journalism Research, Theories, Methods, Findings, Future. So there's a lot of increased interest in studying journalism and journalists. And it's a little bit ironic, I think, because if you look at the history of mass communication research, I think a lot of the founders, Lazarsfeld, Laswell, people like that, were concerned with actually broadening the focus of what they consider to be narrowly focused journalism research into more general mass communication research. And so I think we've kind of come full circle from the 1930s when there was this increased emphasis on mass communication more generally. Now we're coming back and focusing more on journalism and journalists. Even as early as 1979, Richard Gray, who was the director of the School of Journalism at Indiana, and I were arguing that scholars in our field had become more concerned with media audiences, media effects, than with the production of media messages. We argued that many mass communication researchers took media messages as a starting point and then asked about their effects or asked about how audiences use media. And certainly the agenda setting research was in that tradition. I mean, the original agenda setting studies were designed to measure media effects. You know, what's the relationship between the media agenda and the public agenda? But I think we argue that there should be some concern with studying journalists and the producers of messages, some concern with trying to figure out why media messages are the way they are to begin with. And then in 1991, Pamela Shoemaker and Stephen Reese made this same point in their book, Mediating the Message, which has been republished at least once, and I think they're working on a new edition of it. They wrote, most books on mass media research mainly cover studies dealing with the process through which the audience receives mass media content or with the effects of content on people in society. We believe that it is equally important to understand the influences that shape content. And that's what Ray and I were basically arguing in 1979. And I should say that argument in '79 was not well received by some people who had made a career in studying media effects. They thought we were saying, well, you know, that's not important, or that's not what we should be doing. Even though we tried to say we just want to balance out all this research on media use and effects with research on the influences that shape media messages. Well, there were studies of journalists and journalism before the 1970s, of course, but they were few, I think, compared to the dozens of studies of media uses and effects. It wasn't until 1971 that we had the first big national survey of U.S. journalists, as I mentioned before. And then we followed up with these surveys in '82, '92, and 2002. And just last fall, we did the first panel study where we actually went back and tried to find a good number of the people who were interviewed in 2002 and re-interview them 5 years later. That's the first time that panel design had been used, where you actually interview the same people over time. Why wasn't there more research on journalists in the U.S.? Well, Shoemaker and Reese suggest several factors, and there they are on the slide. Uncritical nature of mass communication research. You can see dependence on media industry funding, interest in media industry and the audiences, also interest in government and other organizations on possible harmful effects of media, especially the effects of propaganda and the possible harmful effects of pornography and other kinds of content in films and television. But I think another reason for the fewer studies of journalists and news organizations has to do with limited access. I think it's still easier to study media messages and audiences than it is to study media organizations and journalists. You've got to have, if you're going to do observational studies of media organizations, for example, you have to have access. You have to have contacts and a way to get in. And my experience in surveying journalists from 1982 to 2007 is that they're becoming more reluctant, as are most people, to answer surveys. One reason for that is I think they're bombarded with surveys, and another reason is that they have more and more to do and less time, and so they're very busy people. I think one of the problems with studies of journalists like the ones I've done is that few studies try to link the traits or the attitudes or the values of journalists and their news organizations with the kind of messages that they produce. A lot of information about journalists collected in those books that are being passed around about their backgrounds and their education, their views about their roles and ethics, a lot of that information is descriptive. and I think it's useful to have baseline descriptive information, especially over time, so you can see trends and changes. But unless we do more to link that kind of information with the kind of messages that journalists and other communicators produce, then I don't think we're going to move much beyond the descriptive level to a more theoretical level, a more general understanding. Now, there have been several recent exceptions to that. There have been some studies, increasingly, I think, that try to link the influence of journalistic characteristics with the kinds of messages, or you could think about this as the kind of agendas that they are setting. One of them was by Stephanie Kraft and Wayne Wanta in the spring 2004 issue of Journalism Mass Communication Quarterly. They looked at the influences of female editors and reporters on the news agenda. Another article in the December 2003 Journal of Communication by Rogers and Thorsten examines news coverage by male and female reporters to see whether or not gender makes much difference in the kind of messages that are produced. And there was an AJ paper not too long ago by Tim Voss, who is now at Missouri, that it tried to examine the correlations between journalists' perceived roles and the roles that were evident in their news stories. Now, we did some of this work back in 1982. We tried actually to correlate some of our survey findings from journalists with the kind of messages that they produced. We asked them to send us examples of their best work, thinking that even though their best work may not be totally representative of what they do, it should, in that work, you should be able to see evidence of the kind of roles and values that they have coming through. And we did this in 1982 and 1992, but these studies that attempt to correlate the characteristics and beliefs of journalists with their news coverage often find very weak correlations. And I think one reason for that is that they're done at the individual level, not at the organizational level. I think if you find news organizations, for example, where a majority of journalists hold the adversarial role in high regard, if you look at the output of those news organizations, you're going to find a different kind of agenda than if you study news organizations where the predominant role is a neutral disseminator of information. But often surveys of journalists can't study these things at the organizational level because you don't have enough people from each single organization. And that's the case with our surveys. They're big random sample surveys, and they include journalists from many, many different news organizations. So it's difficult to study, what impact journalists' views about their roles have on the kind of reporting, kind of content, the kind of agendas they produce, unless you have enough of them from each organization. So that's just what I've said, is that it is possible to aggregate individual level data, but you have to have enough cases from each organization. Now, there are some other influences on reporting, extra media influences that Shoemaker and Rees talk about, economic and political environments, societal ideologies that affect the kind of news coverage and the kind of agendas that journalists produce. But you can't really study those unless you do comparative studies across national and cultural boundaries, so that you have some variance in these kind of extra media factors. There are some studies that have been done. I was involved in one that compared journalists from mainland China, Hong Kong, and the U.S., and looked at their role perceptions to see whether or not it was mainly the culture influencing their perceptions of what they should be doing, or the political systems in the countries. And what we found was that Taiwanese and US journalists were much more similar in their outlook about journalism than were mainland Chinese journalists. And so because Taiwan and mainland China share an overall kind of Confucian culture, we concluded that it was more likely that the political systems of the US and Taiwan were more similar, and the economic systems, and that was having more influence on journalists' beliefs about their roles than the overall culture. So I think in order to build theory, in order to have a more general understanding of why media messages are the way they are and how media agendas get set, we're going to need to try to link what we know about journalists with what kind of reporting they produce, and we're going to try to, we need to link our studies of journalists and journalism with more theoretical research on media uses and effects, such as agenda setting, framing, priming, cultivation, some of these approaches that have been used to study media uses and effects. I think if we did that, we would stand a better chance of developing theories of journalism that could explain the entire process more adequately than we have so far. As I mentioned earlier, I've just completed editing this book, this Global Journalism book with Martin Luffelholtz, and it includes old and newer theoretical approaches. It includes chapters on different methods that can be used to study journalism, and it includes some case studies of journalists from various areas of the world, including China and Europe and the UK, as well as the US and Mexico. I think that we need to, when we're trying to develop theories about journalism and about how the media agenda gets set, we need to look at different levels of analysis, and this book includes chapters on those different levels. We need to look at different dimensions or characteristics of journalists, such as gender and race. If gender and race don't matter in the formation of media messages and media agendas, then why is there all this concern, I guess, with bringing more women and more racial and ethnic minorities into journalism? If it doesn't affect the kind of reporting that's done, then what is the point of that? In proposing this book, we wrote that journalism and journalism research no longer operate within national or cultural boundaries, and journalism researchers will have to set up international cooperation if they want to more adequately and accurately describe and explain journalism and journalists. So I mentioned that one example of a theoretical approach that could be useful in studying journalism and media uses and effects across national cultural boundaries is agenda setting. And of course, that's one of my favorite theories, having worked with Max McCombs and Donald Shaw here in North Carolina. Not on the first study. The first study was done in 1968, 3 years before I came here, the most famous study of agenda setting. But in 1972, we did a study in Charlotte, North Carolina, a three-wave panel study that resulted in a book published in 1977 on agenda setting, and Donald Shaw was the first author of that book. Now, as I said, agenda setting was originally applied to the study of the effects of mass media coverage in elections, but it's been extended to explain how media and journalist agendas develop, as well as how the public agenda is set, and also the policy agenda, which is mainly the province of political scientists, but we've done some research in communication about setting the policy agenda. Especially in recent years, I've been involved in 2 or 3 studies that look at try to look at media, public, and policy agendas all at the same time, over time. I think that two of the most relevant influences on media agendas to journalism research are something called intermedia agenda setting, and then the second one that Shoemaker and Rees mentioned are the norms and traditions of journalism. There are also some studies of source agendas and how source agendas, news source agendas, relate to media agendas. In the U.S. Setting, for example, there's considerable anecdotal and empirical evidence about the agenda setting influence of the New York Times on other news media, as well as the influence of wire services news on the gatekeeping decisions of newspaper and television editors. And we found that intermediate agenda setting is not limited to the U.S. It also has been found in Spain, Germany, and other countries. The outcome of intermediate agenda setting is often a highly redundant news agenda. And I don't want to do that. Sorry. Okay, let's stay with agenda setting for a minute. The outcome of intermediate agenda setting is often a highly redundant news agenda, at least within a single country or culture, but across countries or cultures you can find considerable variation in media agendas due to differing norms and traditions of journalism. And those have been found in Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK by various authors. I was involved in a study comparing comparing Great Britain and the US media and campaign agendas some years ago, and we found the same thing, that the differing norms and traditions of journalism, even in countries as similar as the US and Britain, result in fairly different campaign agendas, and they result in different levels of influence by politicians and their parties on the media agenda. I think that journalism is, of course, only one form of public communication, but it's one of the most important, if not the most important, for any democratic system of government. And some of the theories that are successful in describing and explaining other forms of public communication, such as advertising, public relations, entertainment media, are not likely to fully apply to the study of journalism and journalists. But journalism is not so different from these other forms of public communication that it needs completely different theories either. And I think agenda setting is a good example of this. So I hope that in the future, those of us who study journalism will do more to try to link our studies with those of media uses and effects, especially some of the theories that have been developed about media uses and effects, to produce a more unified, theoretical, and useful body of knowledge about this complex process of public communication known as journalism. So I think I will stop there and take any questions you have. Thank you.
Do you think there'll be any journalists in the next 10 years to study?
I do. Even with all these layoffs, I saw this story about the NNO trying to buy out a lot of their journalists. There's still going to need to be some people, reporting what's going on. And some of the, a number of the internet sites, a number of the websites that have news headlines don't employ their own reporters. I mean, they're taking those news headlines from the wire services, they're taking them from mainstream media. Somebody's going to have to be doing this reporting. I don't know whether, I think we'll still tend to call them journalists. Not sure, but somebody's going to be doing this. I don't think it's going to be all citizen journalism either, because I don't think think there are too many citizens who will sit through a lot of governmental meetings and sift through a lot of governmental records to try to produce the kind of news stories that we need to have actually to understand what our government is doing on all different levels. So, I think there will be journalists. There'll probably be fewer of them, though. Probably fewer.
Well,
our studies of journalists have actually shown that the total number that we estimate in the U.S. has dropped from 82. I think we were estimating around 122,000 journalists. That is full-time news people working for traditional general interest news media in the U.S. About 122,000. Our last study in 2002 puts that at about 116,000, I think. So there was a drop of about 6,000 during that time. I suspect that if we did that estimate again, that it's dropped even more. Might be below 100,000 by now in the U.S. That's still a lot of journalists, though, compared to other countries of the world.
Well, we'll talk about that point you raised there about looking at messages and looking at effects of gender differences and ethnic differences and so forth, et cetera, to see whether or not those goals are worthwhile or diversifying the newsroom. But couldn't you make an argument, regardless of whether or not you found the effect or not, they're worthwhile in the same sense that a lot of studies have shown little effects of obscenity in certain conditions, but the society may decide they don't want, under certain conditions, obscenity, regardless of whether or not it's having that kind of effect or not. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's true. I don't mean to argue that if we don't find any differences, any significant differences between men and women journalists, or between main white majority and racial and ethnic journalists, that we shouldn't still try to include more.
But don't you think that
I don't mean to argue that, but I'm just saying there is an assumption that it makes a difference.
But don't you think that, in a way, that whole issue is worth thinking about, because a lot of strict empiricists do seem to take the point that if you don't have a social effect, it's not significant. But there must be many, many policy issues that are just significant at some other level, philosophic level or religious level or something, right? But regardless of whether or not it has an effect.
Yeah. I mean, if you take a strict empirical approach, you only find what you measure. And I mean, that was the problem, I guess, with media effects research for a long time was, you're measuring deeply held political attitudes and opinions and they don't change, then you conclude media don't have any effect. If you start measuring things like agendas, you find, well, there are effects. So it does, depends on what you measure. Craig?
A few questions for you. First, who is a journalist, and what are the criteria for determining who's a journalist, and do you think those criteria should be agreed upon?
Well, in order to study journalists, you have to draw the boundaries somewhere.
Okay.
I mean, we've tended to follow the lead, of the original Johnstone study, which is that a journalist is anybody who has direct input on the content of media, the news content of media. So for a while, librarians were not included because they didn't have direct control over content. For a while, photographers were not included in the original Johnstone study because they worked with reporters who told them what to photograph. Well, we've since then included them because it's obvious that a lot of photojournalists work very independently on their own and make decisions about, what kinds of things they're going to record. And so that's how we've tried to define journalists. And we've also stuck with, in our studies, with full-time employees of traditional news media organizations, general interest, English language news organizations. Well, that definition is becoming increasingly outmoded, I think. I mean, with all of, the part-timers, freelancers, bloggers,
consider the trade press journalists, or?
Well, in our studies, we wouldn't. We didn't. So what we have is a very restrictive definition of news people. And we didn't include people who work for any media that are geared toward ethnic groups, more specialized media. If you do that, if you allow people to self-identify themselves as reporters or editors or whatever, and you look at the census data, then you find not 120,000, but more like 500,000 people who identify their jobs as being an editor or a reporter or a writer. And it's a much bigger number of people. But of course, a number of these people are working on things that publications that we would not consider to be news publications, like Sailing Magazine or something. There are a variety of specialized magazines, that are not considered to be general interest news magazines. In our studies, I think there are only about 16, 18 general interest news magazines that are included in the sample. So what we have is a very restrictive definition of journalists, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to defend it. It's because there are just so many more outlets for news and information. The boundaries between news and information are becoming increasingly blurred. But I still think if you're talking about politics and government and democratic forms of government, there's a core group of people who are concerned with public issues, with government, with policy, with elections, that are of most interest to me personally, but I understand.
Well, how would you handle the ethnic press on those issues that are of general interest, or politics and so on?
Well, I think they do deal with a lot of those kinds of issues, and so I'll leave it to somebody else to study those kinds of journals, I guess.
Speaking of politics, I think this week we heard a lot about the press, the media, journalists as this monolithic force.
Liberal
at the
media.
Republican convention. And it was almost like, the media was the foe, the political opponent. Could you comment on that? How do we study that kind of phenomenon?
Well, there have been a lot of studies of the credibility of media that suggest that, it's declining, not only among politicians, but among the public in general. And there are lots of studies of media bias, that suggest that there are both liberal and conservative biases in the media. I haven't really I haven't done that much study of public attitudes toward the media, but I've kind of followed it. I mean, there are, the various books and articles about it. I think it's kind of like politics itself in this country, in that those attitudes about the media seem to be becoming a little more polarized than they used to be, which is not a good thing, I think. But
Well, what about the charge about the liberal elite media? And that's part of what you've been studying in these books. And would you say that's a reasonable charge?
well, our studies show that there, among the journalists we've studied, that there are certainly more who lean to the left of center, and there are certainly more who identify with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. I mean, we've shown that over time, but they're not hugely different from the population percentages. I mean, they differ by, I think, if you look at the percentage of journalists who identify with the Democratic Party, it's about 10% more than the general public. So, I mean, that, there's some evidence there that maybe, journalists are more liberal in general than more and more channels of news, it's certainly possible, you know, to find many conservative TV shows, Fox versus CNN, for example. It's certainly possible to find many conservative websites. There's no shortage, I think, of conservative media as well as liberal.
Can you speak to any research that you found interesting about the shift to a 24-hour news cycle, or any research that you'd see going forward in that area?
Yeah. In this follow-up study that we did last fall, we have a lot of questions in there about journalists' working conditions and job satisfaction, and we have a lot of journalists telling us that the 24-hour news cycle means that they have less and less time to do independent reporting, or what used to be called enterprise reporting, because they have to keep updating the websites. They have to keep, you know, current hour by hour. Some of them have instructions that they have to update the website so many times within a given day. I think that's not good for quality journalism reporting. I think people don't have time to do, you know, to dig into things and to do reporting. It's going to be more and more superficial. And coupled with cutbacks in the number of journalists at various news organizations, as well as increased pressure to keep updating things constantly during the day, I think that's not a recipe for good journalism, and it's coming out in some of our studies. We're finding decreased levels of perceived autonomy, freedom to select stories, freedom to work on, to emphasize different aspects of stories. We're finding decreased job satisfaction among a number of these journalists. So there are some trends, you know, that are coming out in our research that I think are not good. Not good for journalism, not good for democracy, for democratic forms of government where people are supposed to be informed about what's going on. In fact, a lot of the, one of our students, one of our doctoral students at Indiana, has been looking at the IRE database, Investigative Reports and Evidence database, and has noticed a decline in the number of investigative projects being done around the country over time, and also is looking at who's setting the investigative reporting agenda, and he's found that a number of public interest groups, a number of different groups, not journalists, are doing investigations and then passing them off to journalists. And in some cases, journalists aren't really revealing the source of these investigations until way down on the news story, when they might mention that the study was actually done by the Center for Public Integrity or something like that. Again, that's kind of disturbing too, to think that, you know, well, maybe the investigative reporting agenda is no longer under the control of journalists anymore, who are supposed to be fairly independent, but rather it's special interest groups who are doing some of this.
Are there any trends between what he's finding and what you're finding in submissions to JK? Similarities in terms of types of media studies and concerns about democracy?
The modest stuff in agenda setting research, for example, that's dealing with the polarization effect, that people are getting narrower and narrower agendas that they're exposing themselves to because they have so much selectivity that they go and identify only a set of sources that reinforces their position. That's really kind of on the problem.
But I still think it's important to study journalists and try to make these links between, you know, their characteristics, their working conditions, and what kind of agendas they're producing. Not only first level agendas at the issue level, not only what issues are they covering, but also second level agenda. What attributes of those issues are they emphasizing in their coverage? Because we know, we're fairly certain from a lot of policy agendas than between policy and public agendas. In other words, the public is, a lot of policymakers are using the media as a way of estimating what the public concerns are. Sometimes, not. And then sometimes if you have measures of the public agenda, you see that they're not that highly correlated with policy agendas.
How do you measure policy agendas? Are you doing surveys with policymakers or?
No, the way a lot of studies have done it, and the way these studies that I've been involved with in the last few years have done it, is to look at the bills that are introduced at the state level or at the federal level. Bills introduced, sometimes looking at bills that are actually passed, which I think is a better measure in a way, if you're really interested in policy. But no, it's not based on interviewing policymakers.
Can you talk about some more of the trends that you've seen over time? Can you talk about some more of the trends that you've seen over time? Maybe something that you think might be moving in a positive direction, like the globalization or
Positive trends. There are some. I mean,
Look, I don't have to be asked about next. You have to think about it.
Did it come up with something? I do have to think about that. Yeah, a lot of the trends are in the other direction. But, well, I think one positive trend that's come up in recent studies is that, I guess this is positive, that journalists are more reluctant, or more journalists are reluctant to use some questionable reporting methods, like paying for information or posing as somebody else. Now, you could regard that as positive in an ethical sense. That's good. But if you are interested in hard-hitting investigative reporting, you might say, well, maybe that means they're not as aggressive as they used to be trying to get stories, So, I don't know how you interpret that one. I think you could interpret it at least in those two ways. But we have found that. And we have found that pay for journalists, from at least from 92 to 2002, increased at a faster rate than inflation. I don't know about 2002 to the present, whether that's still true or not.
Now they're just not getting paid at all. They're not. Yeah.
And, there's still people who love what they do in journalism. I mean, there's still people who, we get a number of positive responses when we ask open-ended questions like, why did you go into journalism? Or if people say that they are, well, on the job satisfaction measure, I mean, we have found some declines in the percentage who are very satisfied. But if you add together the percentage who are very and fairly satisfied with their work, it's still a much greater number than the percentage you say are dissatisfied. Somewhat or very dissatisfied. So I mean, if you look at the whole picture, you still have a lot more journalists saying, yeah, I'm very satisfied, or somewhat, at least somewhat satisfied with what I do. So it's not all negative. Other trends. Well, it's hard to think of other positive trends, really. There must be some. Take a look at the books. I'm just not remembering them all. Yeah, you know, Justin.
Hi. So I actually read your book, and one of the things that I was interested in the case studies was, really being able to see that, and this is a truism, but other countries really have fundamentally different journalistic systems to ours. Even countries that we would consider to be other Western capitalist democracies that we would like to compare ourselves to.
Right.
And a lot of those types of countries, Germany, France, Britain, have partisan press. And something that we tend to decry in our studies here is, the press is getting polarized. We're no longer hanging on to these values question of, so what's the big deal if our press is becoming more polarized? Could you speak to that a bit, and so either in an empirical or more philosophical way?
I think a system of more polarized media or more partisan media works better when people are aware of the partisan biases of the different media and also are more attentive users of media. And I think the danger here is that a lot of people are getting news from maybe one source, one or two sources, and if they're not fully aware of it, if the media themselves don't come out and say, yes, yeah, we're conservative, we're liberal, if they're not open and transparent about it, then I think there's a danger of people being influenced without really knowing what the bias of different media. Also, we have a different political system here than a lot of those other countries. I thought about this. I mean, we have this winner-take-all majoritarian system, two-party system, basically. And a lot of those other countries have parliamentary systems where different parties can have influence and form coalitions with other parties. Our political system is not quite like that. In many cases, it's winner-take-all. We don't have very many states where the electoral votes are divvied up, according to the popular vote or anything. It's just winner-take-all. So in a system like ours, I think maybe there is more danger in having more polarized media. I'm not sure about that. Not sure. Justin?
Yeah, I was going to follow up to Autumn's question about positive developments in contemporary journalism and ask you your opinion of not-for-profit investigative journalism. You mentioned the Center for Public Integrity. Something that I see as a positive development in modern journalism, particularly investigative journalism, and the money is there. Chuck Lewis at the Center has raised $35 million in the last 2 decades for investigative projects that increasingly shrinking newsrooms and their budgets couldn't afford to conduct. And so I was just curious as to what your feelings are about the not-for-profit investigative journalism model.
You may have to state that louder.
Yeah, did everybody hear that question about what my feelings are regarding the how did you characterize it?
Just the non-profit investigative journalism.
Non-profit
It's like the Center for Public Integrity.
journalism. I think some of those groups are doing very good work, but I think again it's an issue of transparency. I mean, if journalists are going to use that word, then they should be very clear about who did it, who initiated it, who did it, and not bury it down in paragraph number 15, story or something, and make it seem as if it's the journalists themselves who are initiating these and doing this investigation.
Well, broadcast outlets have been doing that forever with VNRs, right? Using canned footage from some interest and maybe doing a voiceover. Yeah, that would be one of those interests, the Department of Defense.
And one of the problems with these groups too is that some of them are funded by foundations whose interests change over time. They're not. Some of them are not as long-lived and it's not as ongoing as commercial media over time. So if you're a center and you're funded by a foundation that has an interest in certain issue, certain problems, then you investigate those problems or those issues, and you do it as long as the funding is there. But the funding may be for only 3 years or something. It's not the best. I think it's not the best model for ongoing, investigative reporting of
what do you think of some of the perspectives these younger doctoral students should be getting other than journalism, psych or communication? What kinds of perspectives you think are particularly useful in theory building?
Well, it depends on what you're interested in. I mean, if you're interested in effects, especially individual level effects, well then I'd recommend social psychology and psychology courses. If you're interested in more macro level or aggregate level kinds of effects and policy, then I think sociology and political science is better. If you're interested in communication and culture, cultural questions of culture, anthropology, probably. But in the end, I don't know if it's true here, we require all the doctoral students to take both quantitative and qualitative research methods courses. And I think that's really important. After working with, you mentioned that I took so many statistics courses here, and I did. And I've worked with quantitative data for a long time, but I know the limits of quantitative data too. I know that the numbers can't tell you everything that you need to know. And that's one reason in our surveys of journalists that we've incorporated more and more open-ended questions, is that we want them to tell us in their own words why they are satisfied or dissatisfied, or what their working conditions are like, or why they answered a quantitative question a certain way. Otherwise, we're guessing, or we're correlating things that we measured in our surveys to try to figure out what are the best predictors of these answers. But of course, we're limited by what we measure. So my advice would be, get a good grounding in both quantitative and qualitative methods if you can, because a lot of the questions you'll need to answer won't be answered by either numbers or words alone, but you need both.
We're actually pushing towards that. Dr. Johnston wants to have one qualitative and one quantitative methods course, in addition to the general methods course, offered every semester starting in the spring.
That's mandatory?
No, not according to the published guidelines, but according to what your chair tells you, yeah. There are ways around published.
Are there other questions that anyone would like to ask Professor Weaver?